Okay, good morning, everyone. At this time, we will continue with presentation of the state's evidence in this matter. Mr. LaPrenzi.
We call Dr. George Sterbenz to stand.
Sir, if you would, back to raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Sir, if you would, please introduce yourself to the jury by telling them your full name and spell your last name for the court reporter.
My name is Dr. George Sterbenz, S-T-E-R-B-E-N-Z.
And sir, how are you employed?
I am the Chief Deputy Medical Examiner for the Summit County Medical Examiner, located here. The office is located here in Akron.
And just so the jury understands, sometimes I know you call it the medical examiner's office, but what's the difference between a medical examiner and a coroner's office?
Medical examiners are generally forensic pathologists, as I am, who are appointed to the position of medical examiner by well, in this instance, the county executor. Or county executive, and it could also be a mayor if it's a city-based office, or a governor if it's a state-based office. A coroner is a elected individual whose educational requirements will be stipulated by the statutes of their given jurisdiction. Here in the state of Ohio, Summit County and Cuyahoga County are medical examiner jurisdictions where forensic pathologists are appointed as medical examiners by the county executives. The remainder of the state is coroner, where individuals are elected to the position of coroner, just as you might elect a mayor, for example. The educational requirement in the state of Ohio for an elected coroner is for the coroner to be a physician, though that's not consistent throughout the country.
All right. So in order for you to hold your job at the Summit County Medical Examiner's Office, what type of background, training, and education is required for you to hold that position?
So I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and that's actually the requirement to be a medical examiner here in Summit County. So my education is as follows. I went to my undergraduate education was at Rutgers University, located in New Jersey. I attended the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, which is UMDNJ-Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, which has recently changed its name back to Rutgers Medical School. I did a residency in anatomic pathology at New York University Medical Center, which is located in New York City, and a fellowship in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the City of New York. That's obviously in New York City. On completion of my educational training, I did become boarded by the American Board of Pathology in both anatomic pathology and forensic pathology.
Okay. And so how many forensic pathologists work at the Summit County Medical Examiner's Office?
There are 3 forensic pathologists. There is the Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Lisa Kohler, myself. I am the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner, and there is a Deputy Medical Examiner, Dr. Todd Barr.
And how long have you been with the Summit County Medical Examiner's Office?
For approximately 16 years.
And prior to that, did you work in another medical examiner's office?
Yes.
Or coroner's office?
Yeah, I've worked in both medical examiner and coroner jurisdictions. Upon completion of my fellowship, I continued at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the City of New York, for 3 additional years, where I worked in the boroughs of Queens and Brooklyn prior to taking a position in California as the forensic pathologist consultant to the sheriff coroners of Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo counties. And upon correction, Before going to California, I worked in the regional medical examiner's office located in North Jersey, and then went to the California, where I worked as the forensic pathologist consultant to the coroners in Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo counties. Subsequent to that, I did come here to Ohio, where I've since worked for the Summit County Medical Examiner's Office.
And when you say forensic pathologist, first of all, what's a pathologist?
Yeah, pathology is the branch of medicine which deals with the diagnosis of disease and classification of injuries based upon anatomic criteria, look at direct examination of body tissues and sometimes body fluids. Forensic pathology is a subspecialty of pathology, just as, for example, cardiology is a subspecialty of internal medicine. Forensic pathology specifically deals with medical legal issues such as cause of death, the medical reason why an individual died, and manner of death, the medical legal classification of that death, such as natural or some type of violent death.
All right, so you can be a pathologist without being a forensic pathologist, is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. And as far as the medical examiner's office here in Summit County, you are independent agency from any other department. You don't work for the police department, the prosecutor's office. You are an independent agency that makes its own decisions, policies, and rules, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, obviously, the medical examiner reports to the executive's office, but you work independently as professionals in your duties, correct?
That's correct. The medical examiner's office in Summit County is a department within the executive's office.
Okay. As a forensic pathologist, and we talk about coroners, medical examiners, and part of the functions that you do is to perform autopsies, is that correct?
That's correct.
And just what is the most basic, I guess, definition of what an autopsy is? What does that mean?
So the medical examiner office will perform an autopsy examination when it's deemed that that's appropriate for a death that falls within the jurisdiction of the medical examiner. An autopsy is the examination of a deceased individual, and it's similar to a physical examination that might be performed during life by, for example, your family doctor or your internist, where we will start with a complete external examination of the individual's body. But since it is an autopsy, we'll also continue with a complete internal examination of the individual's body. The internal examination involves opening up the body to examine the organs within the body cavities as they're normally positioned, and each organ is then removed and individually examined. During the course of the autopsy examination, specimens can be retained for additional testing, for example, drug screening.
Okay. And these autopsies that we talk about are referring to, how many autopsies have you performed in your career, if you know?
Yeah, I've been performing forensic pathology, or I have been a forensic pathologist since 1993, and I've performed thousands of autopsies to date, and I've stopped keeping track of the precise number, but it's in the thousands. When I got to 3,000, I stopped counting.
All right. So it's over 3,000, we know for sure.
Yeah, that was a number of years ago.
Okay. So it's many thousands.
Thousands of autopsies, yes.
Okay. So let's talk about specifically about Keith S. Johnson. Did you perform an autopsy on Keith S. Johnson?
Yes.
All right. And when did you perform that autopsy?
So the autopsy was performed on March 21st of last year, 2017.
Okay. And when you did his autopsy, first of all, prior to doing the autopsy, do you gather any information or have any idea of what you're doing or looking for in regards to when you perform your autopsy?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And how is that done?
So the medical examiner's office has medical legal investigators, so I can either directly or through the use of our investigators obtain investigative information such as police reports, EMS reports, and any other type of pertinent investigative information.
All right, so if it was an auto accident, you'd know that before you started your autopsy?
Yes.
Correct? If it was somebody that died in their sleep and we're just trying to, and they never had any hospitalization, you might do an autopsy then?
Yes, so the autopsy is performed in the course of a death investigation that's conducted by the medical examiner's office. The medical examiner's office can obtain investigative reports from other agencies that are also involved in investigating the death of that specific individual.
Okay, and does everybody that dies have an autopsy performed on them?
No.
Okay, so what's the criteria for when somebody is going to have an autopsy here in Summit County?
The medical examiner is charged with certifying cause of death, the medical reason why an individual died, and manner of death. That's a medical legal classification of death. That could be natural or some type of violent classification, such as accident or homicide. When it is necessary for an invasive examination, an autopsy procedure to be performed to reach reasonable degree of medical certainty for determination of cause and manner of death, an autopsy will be performed. Additionally, an autopsy is performed when there is physical evidence on the individual's body that needs to be documented.
Okay, so you said cause and manner of death, and just so we're clear on that, what's the difference between cause and manner?
So cause of death is the medical reason why an individual died. For example, if someone has bad arteries to their heart, coronary artery atherosclerosis, and they have a myocardial infarct or a heart attack, that is a medical reason for dying. A heart attack is the medical mechanism of death. In that specific instance, the manner of death might be classified or can be classified as a natural death. In an individual that dies due to a gunshot wound and they succumb to the injuries imparted by the bullet on their body, on the other hand, this is no longer a natural death. That is a violent death. If they are shot by another person, death at the hands of another, that death will be classified as a homicide. However, for example, if they shoot themselves and there is evidence of intent to cause self-harm with that act, that death can be classified as a suicide, for example. Deaths which are neither homicide or suicide are classified as accident. If it is not possible to make a reasonable determination of whether the death was due to suicidal versus homicidal violence, for example, the manner of death can be classified as undetermined. So, whereas there are many thousands of possible causes of death, medical reasons why an individual might die, there are just a limited number of manner of death classifications. There's natural, homicide, suicide, accident, and undetermined.
All right, so that was five? Five, okay. Okay, so I think you have prepared, because I want to talk to you about the actual autopsy and your findings in this particular case. You have prepared a PowerPoint presentation for us, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to hopefully... Okay, so Doctor, obviously this looks, Keith S. Johnson is who you perform the autopsy on, and is there a process you go through to make sure that who you're doing an autopsy on is in fact the person we're talking about?
In this instance, the body of Mr. Johnson his identity was confirmed by fingerprints, and the fingerprint comparison was performed by the Akron Police Department in this instance.
All right, so you'll take a fingerprint of the person that you have, the decedent that you have, you take their fingerprint, you send it, you don't do the fingerprint examination yourself, correct?
Yeah, I did not personally take the fingerprints from Mr. Johnson's body. One of our investigators with the medical examiner's office did take fingerprints, submitted them to the identification unit of the Akron Police Department, who subsequently did the fingerprint comparison and confirmed that the deceased individual that I performed the autopsy on was indeed Mr. Johnson.
All right. And I guess my question really was actually, you're not a fingerprint comparison expert, correct? You always send that out.
Yeah, I neither took the fingerprints nor did I do the fingerprint comparison.
All right. Okay, so you confirmed that who you have was Mr. Johnson. So let's go through. You tell me when you want the next slide. We'll go through this. First of all, you said the autopsy took place on March 21st, correct? 2017?
That's correct.
All right. And that would have been the day after he was killed or pronounced dead. Is that correct?
Yes. Mr. Johnson was pronounced dead on, I think you said May, but...
So I'm sorry, March.
Mr. Johnson died on March 20th of 2017, and the following day, March 21st of 2017, the autopsy was performed.
Okay. And let me just actually, before we do the PowerPoint, let me show you State's Exhibit number 9. We'll take a look at this, please. Tell me if you recognize it.
I do recognize it.
Okay. And what is that?
This is the autopsy report which I prepared for my examination of Mr. Keith S. Johnson.
And is that an actual that's not the original, but it's a certified copy?
This is not the original report, but it is a certified copy of the original report.
And then you have a copy for yourself there to refer to?
I do.
I'm sorry, 9. So, Doctor, this PowerPoint basically is going to put in layman's terms what basically is in this report, at least part of it. I know it's not all in here, but that's basically what the purpose of this PowerPoint is. Is that correct?
So I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm assuming we're going to show shortly, to demonstrate the autopsy findings for the autopsy of Mr. Keith Johnson. This PowerPoint presentation does include some of the photographs that were taken for documentary purposes during the course of the autopsy. I did personally take these autopsy photos for Mr. Johnson's autopsy. The photos that are included in the PowerPoint presentation are not the entirety of the photographic documentation that was performed during the course of the autopsy. However, it is a selection of those autopsy pictures which I felt were necessary to explain his physical findings. In some instances, I have cropped the photographs to eliminate a background to make the images more presentable to you, the jury.
Okay. So we will go here to the first slide.
So the medical examiner's office, as has been stated, will first gather information regarding an individual's death. And we'll do that in all instances of deaths that are reported to the medical examiner's office. Indeed, this is how we would determine if a death of an individual even falls within the jurisdiction of the medical examiner's office. In this instance, we were told that Mr. Johnson was a 24-year-old man. We, meaning the medical examiner, were told that he was shot while he was riding a dirt bike following an altercation. And this occurred in Akron on Danamede Avenue. And it occurred in the evening of March 20th at approximately 9 p.m. So the motorized bike that Mr. Johnson was riding was also reported struck a parked pickup truck, and he collapsed onto the roadway. It was reported he's on a motorbike, he's shot, hits a pickup truck and then collapses down to the roadway. Emergency medical services, or EMS, was dispatched to the scene, and that call went out at 9:01 p.m. And they got there very quickly. They got there by 9:04 p.m. And you can see that Mr. Johnson was then evaluated by the paramedics and pronounced dead at 9:15 p.m. So he was essentially dead there when on the scene at Danamead Avenue when the paramedics arrived. If he had any kind of vital activity, if his heart was beating or if he was still breathing, he would have been transported to one of the local emergency departments. But since he was clearly deceased at the scene, he was pronounced dead by the EMS personnel right there at the scene.
Now, can the pronouncement that he's dead, does that come from a medical technician or does that have to be done by a doctor?
Yeah. Keep in mind, a death pronouncement is a legal determination. So Mr. Johnson was pronounced dead at 9:15 p.m. and that's a legal determination that's dictated within the statutes of the state of Ohio, and most states have similar statutes, where it says somebody who is competent to evaluate that individual did indeed evaluate them and determined at that time that that individual is dead. Mr. Johnson may have been dead, physiologically or biologically deceased minutes prior to that. But the 9:15 is the legal pronouncement of time. In the state of Ohio, a legal pronouncement of death does require a physician. That's not true in all states, but it is true here in the state of Ohio. So the paramedics, which are competent to medically assess an individual, will assess that individual, and that also includes placing electrical leads on their body to assess their heart activity, ECG leads. That ECG information is then relayed to one of the physicians in a local emergency room, and together with the physician by telephone in the emergency room and the paramedics who have medical training for evaluating individuals, a legal pronouncement of death can be made. And I can tell you, in this instance, Dr. Felton from Akron City Hospital Emergency Department made the death pronouncement with the Akron Fire Department EMS personnel.
And you get that information from medical records or from EMS report records? Where does that come from?
In this instance, it would be from the EMS run sheet.
Okay. Okay. Are we done with this slide then?
Yes.
Okay.
So that occurred. His death occurred on March 20th. The following day, on March 21st, starting in the morning at 9 a.m., the autopsy examination was performed, and I performed the autopsy examination. Mr. Johnson was a 6-foot, 216-pound man, so he's tall and rather stocky. His body was received to the medical examiner facility with his clothes. He was clothed. They had not been removed by the emergency personnel. And he essentially had no resuscitative instrumentation. He did have some ECG leads placed on his body. Obviously, those were placed to facilitate his death pronouncement. But he had no other resuscitative instrumentation. Next slide. Can I advance it? No.
I don't think you can. And
you can mark on it, but Mr. McKenzie will have to.
Okay.
And I forgot we don't have that. Yeah.
Okay. As received to the office, Mr. Johnson had some blood stain on his body. There was some blood stain on his clothing, and his jacket is dark in color, so it's hard to see that, but we can see that he does have some blood stain on his face, and there's also a little bit of blood stain on his hands. Next slide. His clothing had some damage. He had some tear defects. We can see the right sock has a tear defect there, and the knee on the pant leg has some tear defects here and here.
And why are you taking pictures of his clothing to document the tears and things of that nature? And it may be obvious, but just so we're clear.
Well, I'm always going to document how an individual is received to the office, and that includes their clothing. In this instance, we do know that Mr. Johnson was riding a motorbike, and he strikes a vehicle, parked vehicle, and falls off the vehicle. So these physical findings of the damage to his clothing certainly reflect the history that he falls off a motorbike. He has tear defects to the knee area here and here and here, and he's got a tear on his sock also. So this is the kind of clothing damage that can be incurred in a what is essentially a traffic collision.
Okay. Shall we do
Next
the
slide. Okay. Mr. Johnson has injuries. He has both a firearm injury or a gunshot wound, and he has some blunt force injuries. I'm going to talk about both, but the first injury I'm going to talk about is his gunshot wound injury, and this is his fatal injury. He has a gunshot entrance wound to the right temple, as we can see in these photos. And I have on the right-hand side of the screen a close-up of the gunshot injury. And it's this darkened hole on the side of his right temple. In this instance, the darkened appearance of the tissues is related to the fact that I'm doing the autopsy the following day, and the tissues have some drying artifact causing the soft tissue beneath the surface of the skin to look a bit darker. But he has no soot deposition within that wound. There's no muzzle imprint about that wound, and there's no stippling. Stippling would be injuries from little, I don't know if I can even do that with like little dot-like injuries. I'll just make little arrows. Little dot-like injuries of skin erosion occurred by partially burnt and unburnt gunpowder striking the skin surface. And this can occur if the muzzle of the gun is close enough to the skin surface at the time the gun is fired. So in this instance, there is no gunshot residue imparted about the entrance wound. There is no muzzle imprint, there is no stippling, and there's no soot deposition. Next slide. So I'm using, this is a diagram to help understand the concept of range of fire and the concept of presence or absence of gunshot residue on a target surface. So when a handgun, as we see in this upper image here, when a handgun is fired, in addition to the bullet over here exiting the gun, there's also soot, that's that black stuff there. There's the little granular material, which we see here, clear that. Little granular material, which is the partially burnt and unburnt gunpowder grains. And there's gases of combustion, which obviously can't diagram gases very easily. If the muzzle of the gun is close enough to the target, some or all of that material can strike the target. As the muzzle of the gun is pulled away from the target, only some of that material might strike the target. So in this instance, where the muzzle of the gun is quite close to the target, soot and stippling is striking the target. In this instance, where the muzzle of the gun is farther away, only the granular material, the stippling, the unburnt, partially burnt gunpowder is striking the target. The cloud of soot isn't making it all the way to the target. So this is attempting to demonstrate that the position of the muzzle of the gun to the target can influence the pattern of the deposition of gunshot residue. To the right of the screen are muslin target test fire surfaces. The upper image here shows what we would call close range, where there's stippling and soot deposition. The lower image is what might be termed intermediate range, which shows there's only stippling. Next slide. If the muzzle of the gun is actually touching the target, it's possible for the muzzle of the gun to imprint a muzzle imprint on the target. And that, in addition to injecting all of the elements of combustion, the gases, the soot, and the unburnt and partially burnt gunpowder into the wound, is characteristic of a contact wound. That didn't occur in this instance. Next slide. Now, if the muzzle of the gun is almost touching the target, but not quite, within a few millimeters of the target, gases of combustion won't make it into the wound, but there will be a dense distribution of soot and stippling about the entrance wound, and that clearly did not occur in this instance. Next slide. If the muzzle of the gun is far enough away from the target so that grains of gunpowder still strike the target, but the soot does not, or there might be some soot, this is generally classified as intermediate range. I want to impress that the presence or absence of soot is variable because wounds tend to bleed, and the soot is not necessarily permanent on the surface of the skin. So there's many reasons why soot may wash away from the surface of an injury. Whereas stippling, the partially burnt and the unburnt gunpowder, particularly on a skin surface, it might fall away from the surface of the skin, but it can leave a little injury on the surface of the skin, a little red mark. And in some instances, it can be driven into the skin. So stippling is sometimes also referred to as tattooing or gunshot tattooing. This type of pattern of injury is termed intermediate range injury. Next. When there is no gunshot residue or muzzle imprint evident on an injury, it's called a long range or distant injury. So the absence of a patterned deposition of gunshot residue is a long-range injury. In any instance, there might be some anomalous grain of gunpowder that flies from the muzzle of a gun many feet across the room and strikes a target. That, however, is not a pattern or a patterned deposition of gunshot residue. So one can only make statements to a reasonable degree of certainty regarding patterned deposition of gunshot residue. One or two anomalous grains of gunpowder are not helpful in classifying range of fire, and would be classified, and if that's all there is, it would be classified as long range. Next slide. So contact is an injury where the muzzle of the gun is touching. So in this screen here, this bottom axis is distance and in inches, and this is 0 inches. So by definition, contact is touching. There's no distance. It's at 0 inches. Okay, near contact, if that option of classification is being used, always implies within a fraction of an inch or a few millimeters from the target. In this instance, we're really concerning ourselves with intermediate versus long range or distant injury. Mr. Johnson has a long range injury. Next slide. I want to impress upon you that we can talk, or one can talk in terms of generalities of distances for handguns. And all of these distances are specifically for handguns, not for rifles and not for shotguns, just for handguns. So in terms of generalities of handguns, the lower end where patterned gunshot residue deposition can occur can be as, I'm going to restate that. The lower end for range of fire, where pattern deposition of gunshot residue might stop occurring for some small handguns, might be as close as 6 inches, a muzzle to target distance of 6 inches for some handguns. And those would be smaller handguns that generally shoot smaller caliber bullets, such as .22 caliber handguns. However, for some guns that are larger and shoot larger caliber bullets with more bullets that have cartridges containing more gunpowder, the distance can be higher, somewhere up to 18 or maybe 24 inches, where still some patterned deposition of gunshot residue is imparted. Which means there's a range of uncertainty for handguns, when we speak in terms of all handguns generally, of somewhere between 16 inches and maybe 18 to about 24 inches. I think the important concept here is a injury that's classified as long range or distant could occur if the shooter, the individual shooting the gun, is many feet away from the individual who shot. They could be across the street. They could be yards and yards away. On the other hand, it's possible that a long-range injury can occur with two individuals standing fairly close to each other, as long as the muzzle of the gun is far enough away so that no patterned gunshot residue deposition is imparted. So two individuals can be realistically face-to-face within a few feet of each other and still impart a long or distant range injury. So one might argue that a better term for long or distance range injury would be non-contact and non-intermediate. Next slide.
Before we go to the next slide, so basically, doctor, at this point, let me just kind of go back. In your process, you're not just looking to see if the man died of a gunshot wound. You're looking to see if the history that's given is also consistent with what you're finding in your autopsy. So the history was that there was a motorcycle accident where he hit the ground, and in that you're saying what you're finding on the clothing and some of these injuries are going to be consistent with that. In this case, you probably heard that the shot was some distance away, and so you check to make sure, okay, let's make sure that there's no stippling or soot or contact injuries to confirm or at least be consistent with the history you're getting. Is that fair?
Yes. So Mr. Johnson has injuries consistent with falling off a motorbike. He also has a gunshot wound consistent with having been shot. The appearance of the entrance wound is consistent with a long range or distant injury, and that is consistent with history of the individual shooting the gun being at a distance from him, recognizing that doesn't necessarily preclude the individual shooting the gun being somewhat closer to him also.
So if you had a history of somebody being shot from across the street, and you look at the injury and you see contact wound type evidence, that's going to be concerning to you, correct?
Yeah. If an individual has a contact or physical evidence that would classify the gunshot injury as a contact wound, but the history suggests the individual shooting that individual is many feet away from him or her, then the history is inconsistent with the physical evidence.
All right. So that's why, as a doctor and a forensic pathologist, you're looking at these things so intently to make sure that the history and everything matches up. Is that fair?
Yes, I'm doing evidentiary documentation, and we can take that physical evidence and look at it and make a determination if the physical evidence is consistent with his history or information being provided regarding how the injury occurred.
Thank you. All right, so you want the next slide?
Okay. If we look at the opposite side of Mr. Johnson's head, he has some scrapes on his face, which I'll talk about in a bit, but he has no exit wound. X-rays of his head, and these are X-rays, these two X-rays were performed at the medical examiner's office after when Mr. Johnson was already deceased, show that there is whitish object sitting inside his head. That's a radio-dense object, and that's a bullet inside of his head, as we will see. So Mr. Johnson has no exit wound, and he has one intracranial bullet. And this is consistent with one gunshot wound to the head. Next slide. Okay. This is a series of pictures to explain how the bullet entered Mr. Johnson's head. The entrance wound is clearly at the right temple. Now, the autopsy examination involves doing internal examination of the deceased individual. An individual's head the examination of the head would involve making an incision from behind one ear up over the top of the head and to behind the opposite ear. Then the scalp is reflected in a forward direction over the face for the front of the scalp and backwards for the back of the portion at the back of the scalp. In this image, I have the photograph of Mr. Johnson prior to internal examination, and the middle and the right photographs are obviously during the course of the internal examination. So Mr. Johnson's face or scalp was reflected in this downward direction over his face as part of a normal autopsy procedure. This yellow box here, this yellow box shows that this area here in this middle photograph is a blow-up of that area. Okay. Here's Mr. Johnson's ear. This is a bit of Mr. Johnson's ear here. It doesn't look like an ear in this image because we can see the margin where his scalp is reflected down, and it's bending the ear down with it. But that's an anatomic landmark. That's just to help you orient yourself that this corner right there is that corner right there on that image. And this is the top surface of the skull here, as this is the top of his head over here. Okay. His nose is not in this image. His nose would be over here somewhere. His eye would be down here somewhere. But the scalp has been reflected in a downward direction. So if we pulled the scalp back up, this area here would come back up to about to here. Okay? So this is the area of the right temple. This area here is where the entrance wound is. But after I've reflected the scalp, and I've also removed a muscle that sits right there, and this muscle comes down like that. That's the temporalis muscle. It comes down to your jaw. It helps you chew. That muscle has been removed, so we can look at the skull directly. There's an elongated defect, which we can see here, in the bone caused by the bullet. So the bullet is striking the skull tangentially. This is a type of defect that can be called a keyhole defect. It's not exactly a classic keyhole defect, but I think it's best classified as, or I think we can use this term, keyhole defect, because it's an oval entrance defect in the bony skull. Okay, so what I want to point out is this area with blood in the scalp here would fold up to this area here at the right temple. So the bullet entered the scalp over here and then penetrated obliquely, tangential to the surface of the skull, through the scalp and through the muscle sitting on the side of the head, and then entered the skull with a tangential orientation. Because, can we go to the previous image? Knowing that the entrance wound is somewhere here, up here, we can see that on this image, the bullet does not cross the midline of the head. It stays on the right side. This is the right here. This is right. This is left over here. It's staying on the right side, and it's towards the back of the head on this lateral image. Okay, next slide. Actually, 2 slides. Okay, so I then removed examine the inside of the head, and that's done after the scalp is reflected forward and backward. A cut is made in the bone across the top of the head. And then the skull can be removed and the cranial contents can be examined. An intracranial bullet was recovered. Okay, and if we can go to the next slide. This is a specimen photograph of a portion of Mr. Johnson's brain. This is just the right cerebral hemisphere. It's just this half of the brain. What's absent here is clearly the left side of the brain, and we're just referring to this image here. There's no left side of the brain. There's also none of the lower portion of the brain. There's no cerebellum, which would sit here, and the part of the brain that extends down into the spinal cord, the brainstem, which would come down in that direction, that's not there. But this is just a specimen photograph showing the portion of his brain which is injured. This image here on the left is looking at the brain, the right side of the brain from the right surface of the brain. This is the surface of the brain that would be a butt up against the skull. This image here is the medial the inside portion of the brain, the medial portion of the brain. This flat surface here is the surface of the brain that would touch the opposite hemisphere, the left hemisphere. So we can see that the trajectory comes into this portion, comes into the brain in the temporal area. That's the area over the ear, rather than the area over the eye, because it's coming in obliquely, and it goes in a backwards direction through the brain. So if we flip it over to the other side, which is here, which we see here, the bullet lodgement is right there at the back of the brain. So this is front, I'll put an F. That's front and that's front. That's back and that's back, because the two halves are flipped around, okay? And it's the same half in two different pictures. And there's the bullet that was recovered. We can see that there's some bleeding on the surface of the brain. This is blood in the vascular layer on the surface of the brain, the leptomeninges. That type of bleeding is called subarachnoid hemorrhage, and that's vital reaction. That's something that occurs during life. So we know that Mr. Johnson was alive when he was shot in the head. There's also a second type of bleeding, bleeding between the brain and the skull. I'm not showing a picture of that, but that was there. That type of blood is called subdural hemorrhage, and it was also there. It's also evidence of vital reaction. But so he has intracranial hemorrhage, which is evidence of vital reaction. We know that Mr. Johnson was alive when he was shot. So he wasn't already dead, for example, from injuries from falling off the motorbike. So he has bullet penetration of the brain. This is a bullet to the brain, and that is a fatal injury, and it's a rapidly fatal injury. And one bullet was recovered. It's there. And he has evidence of vital reaction to this injury as evidenced by intracranial hemorrhage. Next slide. Also associated with this gunshot wound to his head are secondary skull fractures that are incurred from the bullet entering his head. And in this image here on the left, remember I told you that I examined the inside of the cranial contents by removing the top of the skull. So we can see where the saw has cut away the skull, and we're looking down at the bottom of the skull. So this is called the basal skull. And this area here is where the eyes would be. This area in the middle is where the middle ears are. This is the back of the head here. So in this image, this is the front where the nose would be. This is the back here. Okay. You can see the opening where the spinal cord is. That's called the foramen magnum. In this area above the eyes, the bone is very, very thin. It's just separating the inside of your head, the inside of the skull, from the eyes. So this very thin bone, which is blown up here, this thin bone here, so here the right eye would be here, the left eye would be there, and the middle part of the nose is right in the middle here. All those bones are thin, and the concussive forces of a bullet traveling through the head can cause fractures. The reason why an individual dies when a bullet enters their head and why they die rapidly, it's not necessarily the tissue destruction caused by the bullet, though that's part of it. It's also the concussive forces that the bullet imparts upon the soft brain tissue. When the bullet enters the head at the speed of a bullet, it causes shock waves to run outward from the track of the wound across the brain tissue. Those shock waves cause stretching of the brain tissue, which stretches the brain cells, the neurons. That stretching is concussive injury, and that makes those neurons unhappy, and they might stop working. So when neurons, due to a blow to the head or a bullet traveling through your brain, imparting a shock wave to the brain, imparts stretching forces on the neurons, and the neurons start to not work normally, that is a concussion. In its most mild forms, you might just have, be dazed. In its most severe forms, you're instantly dead. So concussive injury can exist on a continuum of mild to severe. With gunshot wound injuries, there is this combination of parenchymal injury and severe concussive injury to the brain. And the individuals are, if they are not immediately dead, often have such profound injury, irreversible injury to the brain, that they don't recover. In this instance, Mr. Johnson was dead by the time the EMS personnel arrived a few minutes after his injury. So the important point here is that these fractures to his skull are secondary to the gunshot wound, and they're not due to falling off the motorbike. Next. Okay. The trajectory of this injury is shown by these photographs. I've actually placed a metal probe partially within the wound to help demonstrate the trajectory, because it's a little bit not intuitive based upon the appearance of the entrance wound. It's sharply front to back. It's going sharply in this front to back direction, as shown here and shown here. It is going right to left, but not sharply right to left, because it's going not all the way across the midline. It's going more front to back, and it also goes slightly downward. You can see there's a slightly downward trajectory. And keep in mind that this front to back, right to left, and slightly downward is respect to what I would term standard anatomic position. And standard anatomic position is this, as I'm standing right now. It's me standing in an upright direction, and for my head, my chin is in a forward and somewhat upright position. But when we talk about trajectories with regard to the head, remember, the head, so you turn to the right, turn to the left, you can look up, you can look down. So this trajectory with respect to his head has to be, recognize that it is a head, and the head can move right, left, and up and down with respect to the ground. Next slide. Now I'm going to talk about his other injuries. Remember, I said that Mr. Johnson has what would be classified as blunt force injuries. Blunt force injuries are like skin scrapes or abrasions, skin contusions or bruises, skin tears. All of those types of injuries would be classified as blunt force injuries. And we can see in the center image here that Mr. Johnson has scrapes to like his forehead, here. He has scrapes over the surface of his nose. I'm pulling down his lip in this area here to show that he has scrapes over the upper surface of his lip. And if I pull down his lower lip, he has some abrasion and contusion to the lower lip. These injuries are predominantly over the middle of his face. a little bit off to the side, and they predominantly involve facial prominences, or the parts of your face that jut out. And this is very consistent with one's face striking a flat surface, like the road. So this pattern of injury to his face is consistent with him falling off his motorbike. Next slide. With regards to the rest of his body, he has some comparatively minor scrapes or abrasions on his hands. There's one little scrape here on his right wrist rather. I have them circled. In fact, there's a tiny little abrasion here that doesn't even show up on the photograph very well, but if we blew it up, you'd see it. And some tiny little abrasion here on his, this is the left, right hand, left hand, right, left. Okay, so we have the right here, left here. So tiny little comparatively minor abrasions on his hands. Next slide. And some abrasions which are a bit worse on his lower extremities, his legs and ankles, but they're also comparatively minor. Little abrasions around the knees, little abrasions to the shins, little abrasions around the ankles, and this can be seen on both legs. And all of these images are just showing the straight-on anterior and lateral views of the lower extremities. There's no fractures to his arms and no fractures to his legs. I would also add that there is no injuries to his torso or pelvis, either externally or internally. So there's no injury to the chest organs, the lungs and the heart. There's no injury to the abdominal organs, the liver, the spleen, the intestines. He also has no neck injury. The other autopsy findings is basically an absence of natural disease. He did have some very mild scoliosis, which is a mild curvature of the spine, but he had no significant natural disease. He had been drinking prior to his death. His blood alcohol level was a 0.09% concentration, and his urine screen was positive for marijuana metabolite.
And just a question regarding the urine screen. What things are being tested for in that urine screen?
The urine screen, if we refer to the toxicology report here. If we refer to the toxicology report, the report actually explains what is tested for routinely. And that's what was performed in this instance. So, for example, volatiles, which would include ethanol, which is basically alcohol. It's not the only type of alcohol, but ethanol is the alcohol found in like beer and wine. Acetone, methanol, and isopropyl alcohol are also included as part of the volatile screen. So if any of those other substances like acetone, methanol, or isopropyl alcohol were present, they would have been detected in this screen. Then the urine screen, which only detected marijuana metabolite, also includes cocaine and cocaine metabolite, propoxyphene and propoxyphene metabolite, PCP, methadone, barbiturates, opiates, amphetamines, benzodiazepines, those are drugs like Valium, and tricyclic antidepressants, which are the most common type of antidepressant drugs. And it says cannabinoids. Cannabinoid is the chemical term for marijuana metabolite, and that's what was detected. It also states that positive findings in drugs would be confirmed and quantitated in blood. The exception is the marijuana metabolite. It's not routinely quantitated in blood.
All right, and so the toxicology report you referred to, that's attached to State's Exhibit Number 9, which is the autopsy report, and you've made that part of your report. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that would be it's the back page, and that is performed by chemist Steve Perch. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And he is with your office. He's employed by the medical examiner's office, correct?
Yes.
And you have in here that that he was positive for marijuana metabolites. On the drug screen, it actually uses different delta-9 carboxy THC present. Is that what marijuana is referred to?
Yeah.
Or the metabolite?
That's the chemical name for the marijuana metabolite, which was the test analyzes for.
Okay, very good. And I'm just clarifying so that they don't see marijuana, they see this other thing on here, that's what that means, marijuana metabolite.
Yeah, in THC, the C stands for cannabinoid.
Okay, very good. And then so ultimately, well, let me ask you just a couple clarification questions. The injuries that you saw, not the gunshot wound injury, but the other injuries to his body, the scrapes, the bruises to his face and legs and extremities, those injuries, are they consistent with a motorcycle accident fall?
Yes, so those injuries are consistent with the history of Mr. Johnson falling off a motorbike, and they're also comparatively minor and non-fatal injuries.
All right. And as far as those injuries, are you capable as a forensic pathologist to be able to determine how many times he fell off the bike or in what manner he fell off the bike or anything of that nature?
No.
Okay. Likewise, you already talked about it a little bit, but the position of Mr. Johnson when he was shot, you gave us the anatomical position, but you don't have any knowledge from your examination or any way to tell us what position he was actually in, correct?
I cannot tell you the precise position his body was in at the time he was shot. However, clearly any historical accounts would need to be consistent with the physical findings.
All right. So when you tell us that the trajectory is going downward from the front to the back, that doesn't mean that the angle of the shot was in a downward trajectory, correct?
You mean it doesn't mean that the angle of the shot or trajectory of the shot was downward with respect to the ground?
Correct.
Right. So it could be that the shooter was above Mr. Johnson and the trajectory is downward with respect to the ground. It could also mean that the shot was parallel to the ground and Mr. Johnson's chin was tilted downward. Really, it could also mean that the trajectory was slightly upward and Mr. Johnson's chin was tilted sharply downward. The physical injuries for the gunshot wound are not such that I can determine the position of Mr. Johnson's head on his neck at the time that he was shot. I can't say with certainty if his chin was tilted upward or downward, nor can I say with certainty if his chin was tilted to the right or tilted to the left. All of those are possibilities, could have occurred based upon this physical evidence.
So if you were the shooter and the injuries on approximately this area here, it could have been you were shooting straight this way. It could have been that I was standing sideways looking at you. There's many, many different positions that could have been, that Mr. Johnson could have been in when he was shot.
Yes.
Matter of fact, the number could be infinite, really. Is that fair?
Virtually infinite.
Yeah. Okay. So after you've done the autopsy, you've done the toxicology, you've done everything you've done, you finish up, you memorialize it in your report, and you make your findings in your report. Did you do that in this case?
Yes.
Okay. And ultimately, and I think you have another slide, the next slide, is that correct? Oh, I guess we have the summary. So go ahead and we'll just do a summary. I know you've done a good job of detailing it, but I know you have this slide there.
So in summary, Mr. Johnson has one gunshot wound injury, and that is a gunshot wound to his head. It is a penetrating injury, meaning the bullet stayed in his head. The bullet entered his brain, so this is a bullet to the brain, and therefore it is a rapidly fatal injury. He has comparatively minor external injury, limited to a bit on his hands and wrists and a little bit on his knees and shins and ankles. He has no internal blunt force injuries, and he has no fractures due to blunt force. He has, and as I said, he has no significantly debilitating blunt force injuries. So he did not die due to any of his blunt force injuries, nor did they significantly cause any significant debilitation that would have preceded his death. He does show recent alcohol use, and he has used marijuana in some time prior to his death.
And as far as the marijuana use, and you say it's recent alcohol, and that why is it that you can tell it's recent?
Well, it's recent because it's still there in his blood. It hasn't been fully metabolized. It hasn't been fully eliminated. I can't say exactly when he had his last drink. I certainly can't say he took a shot and then drank a shot and then got shot, for example. I can't say that with any degree of certainty. But he had some alcohol in a period of time prior to his death, such that there was still a significant blood alcohol level that could be detected.
All right. So I guess the import of the question is why is it different that the alcohol is recent even though you detect it, and the marijuana you can't tell if it's recent or not?
Well, remember I indicated that marijuana is not routinely, I'll backtrack. All of these drugs are first detected in urine, and then all, with the exception of marijuana, are then quantitated. So there's qualitative and quantitative analysis. Qualitative analysis just says something is present. Qualitative analysis says how much. In general, we do not, or the amount of a substance present in urine generally is not of use. It's not valuable information because urine is a concentrated fluid, and if one uses, therapeutic levels of a drug, for example, significant amounts of that drug can accumulate in your urine if you don't have an opportunity to urinate. If you just don't pee for quite some time, that drug level in your urine might be high, but that doesn't reflect the amount of drug that you took. So generally speaking, the quantitative portion of an analysis, how much a drug is present, is performed on blood. The exception to this is marijuana. We don't routinely, or we, meaning the medical examiner's office, toxicology lab, and other toxicology labs for that matter, do not routinely quantitate marijuana in blood because there are not reference levels for toxicity for marijuana.
All right.
Or cannabinoids.
So, and I guess maybe I'm not making my question very clear, but marijuana you can find in the system for how long after one may be smoked?
Yeah, so this is marijuana in the urine. So this means he might have smoked a marijuana, cigarette right before he was injured and died. It might mean he smoked marijuana a day before he died. It might mean 2 days. It might mean 3 days. It might mean he might not have smoked for a week, but he had previously been a heavy smoker and had built up cannabinoid metabolites in his body tissues that are continuously being released over a period of time. So I can't, to a reasonable degree of certainty, say exactly when he last smoked. It could be immediately, it could be days, it could even be a week or so prior to his death.
All right. So finally, you made your analysis. You rendered some opinions as to cause of manner of death, and I think you have them here, so why don't you go ahead and tell us what those opinions are.
So remembering that cause of death is the medical reason why an individual died, in this instance, clearly, Mr. Johnson died to the gunshot wound to his head. It was a rapidly fatal injury. The manner of death, in this instance, is classified as homicide. Homicide, for the purposes of the death certificate, refers to, or is a death at the hands of another. In this instance, Mr. Johnson was shot by another person. For the purposes of the death certificate, homicide does not imply intent. So just so you're aware that all individuals who die to firearm injuries inflicted by another person are classified as homicide. Therefore, accidental homicides, like a hunting accident, are classified as a homicide. And intentional gunshot wounds, murder, are classified as homicide. The medical examiner does not determine the degree of intent with regard to homicide.
All right. And all of your opinions that you've expressed here today, are they all within a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
I have no further questions. Thank you, sir. Hold on. Judge, for the record, Mr. Baumel is reminding me, this PowerPoint I am going to ask be marked as State's Exhibit number 10. I'll put it on a disc and mark that. Have that marked as Exhibit 10.
Yes, I think that's perfect.
Okay, thank you, Judge.
Mr. Martin?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
We have met on numerous occasions before, at least professionally.
Yes.
Got some questions, not as long as Mr. Laprenzi. First of all, to be clear, a lot of things that you can't be real sure of is mainly because you were not a witness to this shooting. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct. I was not a witness to the shooting.
And the phrase homicide really refers to an unnatural death. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
That's partially true. Homicide is one of the options for classification of deaths that are not natural, unnatural, or violent. The others are accident and suicide. Homicide specifically refers to death at the hands of another. So it's a death due to an injury inflicted by another person.
Okay.
Irrelevant of intent.
Right. Because homicide doesn't indicate intent, correct,
That's
sir?
correct. The classification of suicide implies intent. And the medical examiner does need to establish intent with regard to suicide, but the medical examiner does not determine intent for classification of homicide.
Doctor, in terms of your findings that there is a lack of stippling or patterning in and around the entrance wound, would indicate to you that it's a long-range shot?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I think it's pretty clear that this is a one-shot fatal. Is that correct, sir?
Yes.
You found no other gunshots on the body, correct?
Yes.
All right. Would it be fair to say, doctor, that this shot caused, for all intents and purposes, an instantaneous death?
Yes. Mr. Johnson's death was either virtually instant or he died within seconds to, at best, a few minutes of death. I think we can say with certainty, I think with certainty it can be said that following the gunshot injury, he was virtually instantly incapacitated. He might have, his heart might not have stopped beating instantly, but his ability for his brain to function normally and carry out directed activity would have been virtually instantaneous upon the injury.
So if I were to suggest, doctor, it went from instant unconsciousness to virtual instantaneous death, that would be fairly close?
Well, I think we can say with certainty that he went from consciousness to virtually instant unconsciousness, followed by a rapid death within seconds to minutes. I think realistically we have to, it's probably not realistic to say that his heart stopped instantly. I think his heart probably would have to have been beating for at least a few seconds. up to possibly a few minutes after the injury. We know with certainty that he was legally dead by the time the EMS personnel evaluated him, which was within minutes of the injury.
Matter of fact, according to your report, Doctor, EMS is called at 9:01, and they arrived, the run report says they arrived at 9:04.
That's correct.
Doctor, concerning this marijuana use, I think you indicated that, is it the metabolites in his system that indicated he's been a heavy marijuana smoker?
There are metabolites in his urine. I can't say with certainty if he was a heavy marijuana user or a light marijuana user. If he had been a heavy marijuana user, then it's possible that he might not have used marijuana for many days, and metabolite of marijuana could still appear in his urine.
Doctor, would a recent use of marijuana possibly cause a mood change in an individual?
I can't say with certainty what type of behavioral effects Mr. Johnson's marijuana use would have had on him at the time of his death.
Are you aware of certain mood changes with people who use marijuana?
As a forensic pathologist, evaluating a deceased individual, I think making statements regarding the psychological status of an individual is, in this, particularly with regard to this instance, is exceeding my level of expertise, or my realm of expertise.
I understand, Doctor. You indicate that your office is able to gauge amount of recent alcohol use. Is that correct, sir?
Yes.
All right. And I believe your report says that the ethanol or alcohol level that you found to be 0.09. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct.
All right. And what is the legal limit in Ohio for alcohol consumption if you were going to operate a vehicle on the highway?
I believe currently it's 0.06.
Well, Doctor, if I were to suggest to you it's 0.08.
0.08. There was talk of making it 0.06.
Unfortunately, that's true for people
I assumed it was
my
lower.
profession. If you would please take it, Doctor, that it's 0.08. In any event, Doc, I don't want to have you misstate something unintentionally. So 0.09, he's over the legal limit. Is that correct, sir?
Yes.
For operating any type of vehicle on a roadway?
Yes.
All right. Doctor, thank you very much.
Doctor, thank you very much.
You may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we will take a short morning break at this time. If you would remain in the jury room, but we will return in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
All right.